You remember the Clark's gauge, the metal slider under your foot in the children's department, the assistant calling a number and a letter to the back of the shop, the new shoes brought out in a cardboard box. 95% of British children, for 2 generations, started every school year that way. At its peak, Clark's employed 1,400 people in a single Somerset village and ran 17 factories across Britain. The Quaker family that owned it built a pool, a theatre, a library, and 1,000 workers' houses around the works. They survived 2 near bankruptcies, 2 world wars, the Depression, decades of cheap imports, the rise of the trainer. They kept the gates open through everything the 20th century threw at them. And then, after 180 years of making shoes in Britain, the factory went silent. How does a name that measured the feet of nearly every British child simply stop making the shoes? What happened in that Somerset village? Chapter 1. The Brothers and the Sheepskin. In 1825, on the edge of the Somerset levels, in a village called Street with a population not much over 500, a 24-year-old Quaker called Cyrus Clark set up in business making rugs from sheepskins. He worked from a site on the high street that belonged to his father-in-law. He'd spent the previous 4 years in a partnership with a cousin, fellmongering, wool stapling, the messy trades of pulling wool off skins and tanning what remained. That partnership had just dissolved. Cyrus had decided, with the kind of small-inspired pivot that founds dynasties, that the skins themselves were worth more than the wool that came off them. He'd leave the wool on. He'd sell rugs. The Quakers had been in Street since the middle of the 17th century. The Religious Society of Friends, barred from English universities because they refused to swear oaths to the Church of England, had turned to enterprise instead. Cadbury made chocolate, Rowntree made sweets, Fry made cocoa, Barclays and Lloyds made banking. The Clarks would make shoes. But not yet. In 1825, Cyrus made rugs. 3 years later, his younger brother joined him. James Clark was 16 or 17, intended by his parents for an apprenticeship to a chemist in Bath. He pleaded with them to let him stay in Street. He had, by the family's later telling, a feel for the business already, and at some point in the early 1830s, looking at the piles of sheepskin offcuts and rejects that accumulated whatever the rug makers did, James had the imaginative leap that made Clarks into Clarks. If you could put sheepskin under feet, why couldn't you put sheepskin on feet? He cut the offcuts into slippers. He named them the Brown Petersburg, or sometimes just the Brown Peter, after the Russian capital where the style was thought to have originated. They were warm and soft and cheap. The work could be done by outworkers, families of stitchers in Street and the surrounding villages who collected leather and a pattern from the tannery on a Monday, made the slippers at their kitchen tables, and walked the finished pairs back on a Friday to swap them for wages. By 1842, they were selling around 1,000 pairs a month. Within a decade, the Brown Petersburg accounted for more than a third of the business. Within 25 years, 3/4. James was made a full partner in 1833. The firm became C&J Clark, the initials it still carries, and the biggest single market in those years was Ireland. Dublin, Cork, Limerick, Waterford, 40% of sales. A Somerset slipper, made in cottage kitchens, walking the streets of the Irish merchant class. The brothers weren't flamboyant. They were Quakers. They wore plain clothes. They used thee and thou with each other and with their employees. They didn't drink. They didn't gamble. They didn't advertise. Newspaper advertising was considered, by the early Clarks, ungentlemanly. They worked hard, and they expected others to work hard, and they ploughed what profits there were back into the trade. Twice in the next 30 years, the business they were building nearly killed them. The first scare came around 1851. The brothers had won 2 prizes at Prince Albert's Great Exhibition at the Crystal Palace, small medals for the quality of their leather work, and the prizes, by the family's account, turned around dwindling sales just in time. The second scare was worse. In 1863, a recession swept through the West Country and through the wider footwear trade. Cyrus and James went, as lifelong Quakers do, to their cousins. The Quaker network, the Frys of Bristol, the cousins among the Sturges and the Gillettes, put together a rescue loan on one condition. The condition was that James's son William would take over. William Stevens Clark was 24 years old. He'd been working in the business for some years already. He was, by every account, more interested in books and ideas than his uncles and his father had been. He read economics. He read about the new American factory system. And he understood, almost from the first day he held the reins, that the cottage industry model his father and uncle had built, outworkers in kitchens, sheepskins cut by hand at home, couldn't survive the century. The Americans had machines. The Northamptonshire boot trade had machines. If Clark's didn't get machines, Clark's would die. Chapter 2. The Mechanizer. William set about the mechanization of Clark's the way a man takes apart a clock to learn how it works. He bought Singer sewing machines. He abolished the small workshops. He built a factory. He moved the outworkers indoors and put them at benches with belt-driven equipment overhead. The change wasn't popular. Some of the older stitchers refused to make the move and disappeared into other Somerset trades. But the productivity gains were extraordinary, and within a decade the loan to the Quaker cousins had been repaid in full. In 1883, William launched the hygienic range, the first shoes Clark's ever made that were designed to fit the actual shape of a human foot rather than a generic last. This sounds modest. It wasn't. The Victorian shoe trade made shoes the way most trades made trousers, roughly to size, broken in by the wearer's own feet. William's hygienics had a left and a right that genuinely corresponded to a left foot and a right foot. They had room for the toes to spread. They had what we'd now call ergonomics, decades before the word existed. The hygienic became the foundation of Clark's reputation for comfort, a reputation the company has spent the century and a half since trading on, sometimes well and sometimes badly. The same year, William bought the cider house opposite the factory. The town of Street had a serious drinking problem. The cider was famously strong, and the men coming off shift on a Friday with their wages in their pockets were, by William's lights, walking into trouble. He removed the license from the cider house and turned it into a coffee house, a teetotaler's establishment, opposite a teetotaler's factory. Some of the men hated him for it. Most of the women, wives and mothers waiting at home for wages that hadn't yet been spent on drink, thought him a saint. William's wife, Helen Bright Clark, was the daughter of John Bright, the radical Liberal MP who'd fought for the repeal of the Corn Laws and against the American slave trade. She brought into Street a politics that matched the Quaker conscience and sharpened it. Their daughters Alice and Hilda became national figures in their own right. Alice as a suffragist and economic historian, Hilda as a physician who would later run humanitarian relief operations in the First World War. Alice Clark would, in 1913, become the first woman to sit on the Clark's board. The women of the Clark family were not adornments to the men's enterprise. They were the conscience of it. By the time William handed the firm to the next generation, around 1900, Clark's employed something close to 1,000 people in Street and was making boots and shoes for the British middle classes from a properly mechanized factory. In 1903, the partnership became a private limited company. In 1908, it became a full limited liability company. A London showroom opened on Shaftesbury Avenue. An American expert called John Walter Bostock, from the great shoemaking city of Lynn, Massachusetts, arrived in Street to bring American factory methods directly to Somerset. He stayed for the rest of his career and was made a director in 1928. In 1910 or thereabouts, the company installed a compressed air engine in the factory. It was made in Bradford by a firm called Cole, Marchant and Morley, and it was named, for reasons no one is now entirely sure of, Anthony. Anthony delivered 2 million cubic feet of compressed air a month to the making departments. He heated the canteen. He supplied electricity to the village. In summer, he heated the open-air swimming pool. Anthony is still there, in the Street headquarters, more than a century later. He's been kept like a relative. There aren't many factories in Britain where the power plant has a name and a personality, but there were few factories in Britain like Clark's. The wars came, and Clark's turned to them. In the First World War, the factory made boots for the army. In the Second, the main Clark's works made aircraft components, torpedo parts, and torpedoes themselves. The village that made slippers was now making weapons that would sink German ships. A wartime designer at Clark's came up with a hinged wooden-soled shoe to cope with leather rationing. It was ugly and strange, and people wore it because there was nothing else. And then there was Nathan Clark. Nathan was a great-grandson of James, a younger brother of W. Bancroft Clark, and an officer in the Royal Army Service Corps. In 1941, he was posted to Burma. His older brother, Bancroft, who'd by then taken charge of the firm back home, had given him a task: keep your eyes open. gather footwear ideas. In 1944, at Staff College, Nathan saw something that stopped him. Off-duty 8th Army officers were wearing crepe-soled suede ankle boots, made in the bazaars of Cairo. Light, comfortable. The kind of shoe a man wore when he wanted to forget that he was a soldier. Nathan sketched them. He sent the patterns home. The Clark's stock committee superintendent, a man called Arthur Martin, read the proposal and told the board the shoe would never sell. Suede, he said, was for lounge lizards. The board agreed. Nothing happened. Nathan, when he returned, made his own prototype. He took it to the Chicago Shoe Fair in 1949, where the fashion editor of Esquire magazine, Oscar Schufler, ran a feature on it. The Americans loved it. A car salesman who'd seen the boot at the fair, a man called Bronson Davis, set up the US distribution himself. Clark's launched the boot in 1950. They called it the Desert Boot. It sold 10 million pairs in its first half-century. It sells still. The Clark's board had said no. Nathan Clark had said yes. The most iconic shoe in the history of British footwear nearly didn't exist because the people running the company couldn't see it. Chapter 3. The Works Floor. By the early 1950s, the Clark's works in street covered most of the central village. Walking through the gates on a Monday morning in 1954, you'd pass beneath the clock tower the firm had built for Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee in 1887, still the most prominent landmark in the village, still keeping time. You'd cross a yard that smelled of leather and machine oil and, faintly, of the canteen's morning bacon. Anthony the air engine was already running. He started every weekday at 6. The factory had departments. You learned them in your first week as a fragmented litany, taught by older workers who'd done every job in every department and could recite the sequence without thinking. Walter Bobbitt, who would work for Clark's for 60 years and whose voice would later be preserved in the company museum, gave the list this way. Skive the stiffeners, take down the sole, hole 'em, tack 'em on the last the uppers, make the threads, sew 'em, turn 'em out, up on last again, put 'em in, colour, iron 'em up, buff 'em, sand 'em or black bottom 'em, polish 'em. That was a shoe. Spoken aloud, it was the rhythm of a working day. 15 separate operations, each one done by a specialist, each one feeding the next. A pair of Clark's shoes in 1954 passed through dozens of hands before it left the building. The leather came from tanneries in the Midlands. The crepe came from the Far East. The eyelets and rivets came from Birmingham. And the people who put them together, 1,240 of them in the street factory alone at the post-war peak, knew the work the way a musician knows an instrument. The skiving room shaved the inside edges of the leather pieces so they would lie flat when stitched. The closing room did the upper stitching, almost entirely women, almost entirely fast, working at singers that hammered like sewing machine artillery. The lasting room pulled the upper over the last, a wooden or metal form in the shape of a foot, and held it in place while the sole was attached. The making room finished everything. Heels, edges, polish. The finishing room inspected. The packing room boxed. The dispatch room sent. In 1947, Clark's installed a CEMA machine, a great hissing thing that moulded rubber soles directly onto the lasted uppers in a single operation. By 1957, 2 million pairs had been made on it. The shop floor men called it the Beast. It saved hours. It made shoes cheaper. It also did, in 1 minute, what a skilled bottoming room hand used to do in half an hour, and the older men watched it with the particular wariness of people who could see their grandsons' jobs disappearing into a metal box. Friday afternoon was wages. Cash in a small brown envelope, name handwritten on the front, the exact amount inside. You queued at a window with your works number. The pay clerk knew you. If your wife had been in to ask after you, she'd ask quietly, and the pay clerk would tell her quietly. There were no secrets in street. There was no need. There were women on the lasting room floor who'd started at 14 and would retire at 65, having done the same job for 51 years. There were men in the making room who'd had their first day at Clark's and their last day at Clark's, and nothing in between. Multi-generational employment wasn't a corporate slogan in street. It was the structure of the town's life. If your father worked at Clark's, you would probably work at Clark's. If your grandfather had worked at Clark's, your son almost certainly would. The shoemaker's craft was passed down the way farming used to be passed down, and the village around it understood itself in the language of the factory's making. The trade unions were a complication. Mark Palmer's authorized history of the firm puts it baldly. Under the Quaker paternalism, schools, libraries, and recreation halls were built, and trade unions banned. The Clark family preferred a direct relationship with the workforce, mediated through works committees and welfare officers, rather than through organized labor. Most of the workers, for most of the century, accepted this. The wages were fair. The conditions were good. The pool was free. Lance Clark, the sixth-generation member of the family who would later design the Wallaby, remembered his own first encounter with the factory floor. He was a small boy, taken in on Sunday mornings as a reward, or, as he put it, as a bribe, for sitting still through the Quaker meeting. He remembered the smell of the leather. He remembered the silence of the machines on a Sunday and the way the factory still seemed to be breathing. It was a magical place, he said. You could believe him. For most of the workers, most of the time, it was. Chapter 4. A town built on Quaker faith. The factory built the town. That sentence is true of dozens of industrial villages in 19th and 20th century Britain, but in Street it was true with a peculiar Quaker thoroughness that's hard to find anywhere else. Begin with Crispin Hall. Built in 1885 by the Norwich architect George Skipper, paid for by William Stevens Clark, named for the patron saint of shoemakers. Crispin Hall was the public assembly room, library and reading room of Street. The library opened in 1924. The small fossil museum opened in 1887. Gustav Holst conducted an orchestra in Crispin Hall in 1922. After a renovation in 2024, it still stands, still hosts craftspeople, still has a cafe where you can sit and read. Across the road, in 1893, the Bear Inn opened. It was a temperance hotel, built deliberately by the Clarks, as a place where travellers could stay without being expected to drink. The Bear didn't have a license to serve alcohol until the 1970s. It took nearly 100 years for the village to allow a pub on that corner, because the Clarks didn't want one, and the Clarks employed everyone. Then Greenbank Pool. The story of the pool runs back to William's daughter, Alice Clark, the suffragist, the historian, the first woman on the board, who left money in her will specifically so that the women and girls of Street could swim. The men and boys swam in the River Brew. They swam naked, as country boys had always done. The women and girls, in the Edwardian propriety of the Somerset levels, had nowhere. Alice's bequest funded what her nephew W. Bancroft Clark eventually built, an open-air heated lido in reinforced concrete and rendered blockwork, the only example of modern movement architecture in Street. It opened in 1937. It was heated, in summer, by Anthony the Air Engine. It still operates today as a charity. It is, by anyone's measure, the most beautiful gift any factory ever gave the town it stood in. The Strode Theatre opened on the 5th of October 1963 with a concert by the Bournemouth Symphony Orchestra. The Clark Foundation Charitable Trust paid for it. Strode College and the Crispin School grew alongside, taking pupils from the village and from the surrounding district. A Strode Day continuation school had been set up for 14 to 16-year-old Clark's employees who wanted to study while they worked. The technical school had opened in 1899, the secondary school in 1913, the Maxim Cinema in 1920, the Street Library in 1924, and the houses. Comfortable workers' housing, built by a building cooperative that William Stevens Clark had instigated in the late 19th century, meant that something like a third of Clark's employees owned their own homes by the middle of the 20th century. Wilfrid Road is the example everyone in Street will give you. Solid red brick terraces with gardens, built for shoemakers, owned by shoemakers. Lance Clark recalled that the old Clark's houses included homework rooms, spaces designed for outworkers' families to do stitching in the evenings, back when the slipper business ran on cottage labour. The architecture of the houses remembered the work. On Ivythorn Hill, a Quaker sanatorium, a convalescent home for sick workers and their families, was leased to the Youth Hostel Association in 1931 and became the first youth hostel in Somerset. It still operates. It's the oldest in the YHA. You could grow up in Street and never need to leave it for anything. You could be born in a Clarks-built house, swim at the Clarks-funded pool, read in the Clarks-funded library, watch a play at the Clarks-funded theatre, go to a school the Clarks subsidised, and walk through the factory gates at 15 or 16 and stay there for the rest of your working life. The wages would build your family. The doctor would see you for free in some cases. The convalescent home was waiting if you needed it. The Bear Inn would not, until 1970, sell you a pint that might wreck the whole arrangement. This was the Quaker utopia. It was real. It worked. It also, inevitably, controlled the people it served. There was a politics to all this generosity, a politics of paternalism, of a family that knew what was best for its workers and structured the village to ensure that the workers got what was best for them, whether they wanted it or not. Trade unions were not welcome. The cider house had been closed. The Bear could not serve drink. The Clarks ran the town because the Clarks loved the town, and the love was not in question, and neither was the running. It produced a community of extraordinary loyalty. It produced workers who would defend the firm against any criticism. It produced, in the village, a population that grew from around 540 in the early 19th century to something between 11 and 13,000 by the late 20th, making Street, by some reckonings, the largest village in Somerset and effectively a single-employer town. 1 in 4 of those people, at the peak, worked for Clarks directly. And then there was the foot gauge. In 1945, the company introduced a small metal sliding instrument designed to measure the length and the width of a child's foot. Clarks had been making children's shoes since 1836, but the 1945 innovation, a choice of 4-width fittings, F, G, H and a wide H, combined with the gauge, gave the firm a near monopoly on the British back-to-school ritual. For 2 and 3 generations, almost every British child had their feet measured on a Clarks gauge. Saturday mornings in the high streets of every market town in the country were spent by mothers and fathers and increasingly impatient children in the children's department of the local Clarks shop. The assistant would slide the gauge under the small foot. She would call out a number and a letter. The shoes would be brought out from the back. The child would walk up and down the carpet. The parents would nod. Bancroft Clark, by then chairman, was the man behind the foot sizing system. He understood that children's feet were the foundation of brand loyalty, that a child who'd been measured for Clarks at 5 would buy Clarks for her own children at 35. He was right. 95% of Britons, by one accounting, grew up in Clarks shoes. There has rarely been a more total cultural saturation than a company sitting inside the start-of-term anxiety of millions of British parents for half a century. The gauge is still in use today. The system Bancroft built has outlived the manufacturing it was designed to sustain. Chapter 5. The Summit. By 1970, Clarks held 9% of the British shoe market by volume, up from 1% in 1945. 17 Clarks factories were operating across the southwest, the southeast, and South Wales. Around 15 of those had opened in the late 1940s, in a post-war expansion that paralleled the boom in council housing and family formation. The Street factory employed around 1,400 people in shoemaking alone. Across the whole UK operation, the figure ran into many thousands more. The company was producing tens of millions of pairs a year. Bancroft Clark had retired in 1967, having spent 25 years as the chairman who built the modern firm. His cousins Tony Clark and Peter Clothier had taken the lead in marketing and manufacturing. Bancroft's nephew Daniel Clark would become managing director in 1973. The succession looked solid. The family looked solid. The factories looked solid. The product range was at its most varied. The Desert Boot had become an international cult shoe, worn by jazz musicians in New York, by mods in London, by Jamaican dancehall stars in Kingston. The Wallaby had been introduced in 1967, designed by Lance Clark, on the basis of a German moccasin called the Sioux Grasshopper. Lance had negotiated the license himself and arranged for production at the Padmore and Barnes factory in Kilkenny, Ireland, which Clarks had bought in 1963. The Desert Trek would follow in 1972, also Lance's design, also a sleeper hit, picked up by Jamaican rude boys who renamed it the Bank Robber. The Polyvelt arrived. The Originals line consolidated. Clarks was now a company that could make a serious business shoe for a Birmingham office worker, a school shoe for a Manchester 9-year-old, and a countercultural icon for a Brooklyn rapper, all out of the same Somerset village. The international expansion accelerated. Blackford Shoe in Toronto had been acquired in 1952, Hanover Shoe in the United States in 1978, Bostonian, also American, in 1979, K Shoes of Kendal, the Lakeland firm where 1 in 5 Kendalians had worked at peak, was bought in 1981 with an undertaking from the Clerks Board to leave it alone for 10 years. The British shoe industry was already shrinking, and Clark's was buying up the survivors. In the village itself, the foundations seemed unshakable. The pool was full every summer. The theatre was packed. The library lent its books. The houses on Wilfrid Road had Clark's children playing in their gardens. Anthony the air engine was still humming. The clock tower still kept time. Daniel Clark walked through the works on a Friday in the early 70s and would have known, by name and by family, almost every senior worker on the floor. He'd have known whose father had retired the previous spring, whose son was about to start, whose daughter had just been promoted from closing room to inspection. This was 150 years of accumulated relationship between a family and a workforce, a thing so deep in the social fabric of the village that nobody could quite imagine what its absence would feel like. But the cracks were already there. Italian shoes were arriving in British high streets at prices Clark's couldn't match. Portuguese shoes were arriving close behind. Brazil was about to begin what one member of Parliament in 1980 would describe on the floor of the House as a dumping operation, selling shoes into the British market at below the cost of production. Trainers, the casual leisure shoe, made in Asia, worn by children who didn't want school shoes anymore, were beginning their slow displacement of formal footwear. Clark's responded to the price pressure by cheapening the materials in some of its lines. Lower-grade leathers, less detailing. The shoes started to look, to some customers, dull. The reputation for comfort held. The reputation for quality began, quietly, to slip. And in the boardroom, in those same years, something even more dangerous was beginning to happen. The Clark family had grown. The number of shareholders with the Clark surname now ran into the hundreds. Many of them had never set foot inside the factory. Many of them lived in London or abroad. Their dividends mattered to them. Their connection to street did not. The summit was 1970, 9% of the market, 17 factories, 1,400 workers in street, the desert boot worn from Tokyo to Kingston. A Quaker dynasty in its 145th year of trading, owning a village it had built from the meadows up. These floors would one day fall silent. The clock tower would still keep time, but the factory beneath it would be gone, and the family that had built it would have lost it, and the gauge that had measured the feet of 95% of British children would be measuring feet in shoes made on the other side of the world. Standing at the summit in 1970, nobody inside those walls could see the cliff they were about to walk off. Chapter 6. The Forgotten Industry. In 1980, a Member of Parliament rose in the House of Commons to speak about footwear. He called it the forgotten industry. He laid out the numbers. 56% female labour, concentrated in low-wage country towns, decimated by imports. He described it as a leaky boat. As soon as one hole was plugged, another opened. First, the Italians had come, then the Portuguese, then the East Europeans through what was then called Comecon. And now, in 1980, the Brazilians, selling shoes into the British market, by his account, at prices that bore no relation to the cost of producing them. A dumping operation, he called it. The British footwear industry was being killed not by superior competition, but by deliberate underpricing from places where the labour was cheaper and the regulation thinner. Northampton had once had hundreds of shoe factories. By 1980, the number was in single dozens. Norwich had gone from around 30 shoe factories to 3 of any significance. Leicester was hollowing out. Kendal would soon follow. The whole British boot and shoe trade, the great Craft Midlands and East Anglian industries that had clothed the feet of an empire, was crumbling town by town, factory by factory, and the politicians who noticed were the politicians whose constituencies were dying. Clark's was the largest of the survivors. That was both its strength and its slow doom. The strength was that it could absorb losses smaller competitors could not. The slow doom was that it was now competing in a market where Italian and Portuguese and eventually Far Eastern shoes were arriving at half the price of a Somerset-made Clark's, and Clark's response, through the late 70s and early 80s, was to cheapen what it was already making. The materials slipped. The leathers got thinner. The linings got cheaper. The detailing got coarser. A Clark's shoe that had cost the consumer £12 in 1975 still cost £12 in 1985 in some lines, but the shoe itself was no longer the shoe it had been. The comfort reputation held. The quality reputation began, in the trade, to slip. Trainers were taking the children's market. Italian fashion was taking the women's market. Clark's was holding the middle ground, and the middle ground was being squeezed from both sides. Inside the firm, something else was changing. The Clark family had grown across 7 generations. By the late 80s, there were several hundred shareholders with the Clark surname, scattered across Britain and the wider world. Many had never worked in the business. Many had never lived in street. They received dividend checks. They read annual reports. They were, in the language of corporate governance, a fragmented shareholder base. In 1986, Daniel Clark resigned as managing director. He had served since 1973, the great-grandson of the William Stevens Clark, who had taken the firm through mechanization a century earlier. His successor was John Clothier, son of Peter Clothier, a manager of the post-war generation. Clothier was a competent administrator who took over a firm whose share price had stagnated and whose institutional investors were beginning to ask hard questions. The hardest question was the obvious one. Why was Clark's still making most of its shoes in Britain? K Shoes, acquired in 1981 to save Kendall from a hostile takeover, was running at a loss. The Somerset factories were running at thin margins. The new Italian and Spanish factories that had supplied the early continental imports were themselves now being undercut by factories in Portugal and the Far East. Clark's UK manufacturing base, the foundation of its identity, was its commercial weakness. Anyone with a spreadsheet could see it. Around 1988, Roger Pedder rejoined the firm as a non-executive director. He was an unusual figure in the family, a Clark by marriage rather than by blood. He had joined Clark's in 1963 as a young man, become personal assistant to the then chairman, married the chairman's daughter Sabella Clark in 1968, and then left street to build a career in retail. BHS, Burton, Halfords, Harris, Queensway. He had co-founded a chain called Pet City. He was, in the language of his own description, a Clark by marriage but not a Clark's Clark. The shareholders worried about performance had pressed him onto the board precisely because he wasn't quite one of them. He was a quasi-outsider, with the rare combination of family standing and external retail experience, and the shareholders thought he might see things the insiders couldn't. He saw them. He saw the cheapening of the product. He saw the costs of UK manufacture. He saw the fragmenting of the family voice. He saw the institutional investors getting restless. And in late 1992, when a London-based investment group called Beresford International began circling, he saw the offer coming. Walter Dixon was the chairman. Dixon, an outsider brought in for his commercial experience, had reached the conclusion that Clark's could no longer survive as an independent, family-owned company. The market was changing too quickly. The institutional shareholders were losing patience. The Beresford bid was, in his view, the rational way out. Sell to a financial buyer. Take the money. Let the new owners restructure the firm with the freedom that no family-controlled board could ever bring itself to apply. In early 1993, Dixon and the majority of the board recommended that shareholders accept the Beresford bid. The figure was £184 million. The Clark family went to war with itself. Chapter 7. The Vote. The extraordinary general meeting was called for the 7th of May, 1993. In the weeks leading up to it, almost every newspaper in Britain urged the family to sell. The Daily Telegraph, on the morning of the vote itself, ran an editorial predicting that Clark's would follow the Cadburys and the Frys, and the Rowntrees and the Lloyds and the Barclays into public ownership or institutional buyout. The Telegraph's verdict was stark. If the bid were rejected, Clark's future looked grim. The institutional shareholders, the pension funds and investment trusts that held large blocks of the company, were almost all in favour of selling. They wanted the cash. They wanted out. The family shareholders were split. Some saw what Dixon saw and wanted the money. Some saw the firm as a sacred trust and wanted to keep it. The bid committee that had handled the negotiations was chaired by a non-executive director named James Power, who would later be remembered in the firm's authorised history with respect even by those who disagreed with him. Hugh Pym, the economics journalist and a member of the family by descent, was present at the meeting. Mark Palmer's history records that the company came, in the end, within a few votes of being sold. But it was not sold. The family, by a margin that nobody who was there ever forgot, voted to remain independent. The Beresford bid was rejected. The institutional shareholders went home angry. Walter Dixon resigned shortly afterwards. The Clark family had reasserted itself. The company would not be sold to a financial buyer. Roger Pedder became chairman at the end of 1993. He spent the next year, by his own account, working out what needed to be done. The conclusion he reached, and which he eventually carried with the family shareholder council he had created as a consultative intermediary, was that the firm could not continue to be run by the family. The decisions ahead were the kind of decisions a family management would never be able to take. Outside professional managers would have to be brought in, managers who, in Pedder's own description, would be more comfortable with making the changes the company needed to recover. The vote had saved the company from Beresford. The vote had not saved anything else. 3 months after the family voted to remain independent, on the 14th of August 1993, the gates of part of the old Clark's manufacturing site opened to the public. The redundant factory buildings on the south side of the street works had been converted in 22 weeks at a cost of £3 million, 18 retail units, fitted out and stocked, ready for the new economy. Benetton, Laura Ashley, Pierre Cardin, Thornton's, Wrangler, 300 new jobs in retail. 50,000 people came on the opening day. They walked through the gates that had once been the gates of the largest shoe factory in Somerset. They bought discount socks where the lasting room had stood. They drank coffee where the closing room had been. The first purpose-built factory outlet mall in the United Kingdom had been carved out of the carcass of the works that had built the village around it. Manufacturing on the original street site itself had already ended, not in some future closure to come, but the year before. By the time the family voted in May, the shoes had already stopped being made on that ground. The factory was dead. The outlet was opening. Clark's Village would, in time, be sold to the property company MEPC for £54 million. The proceeds would be distributed to the long-suffering shareholders. The non-core asset, as the language of the period had it, became cash on the books of the people who had voted not to take cash from Beresford. The wheel had turned. The family had refused to sell the company. The company had begun selling itself in pieces. Chapter 8. The Professional Managers. In 1996, Roger Pedder hired Tim Parker as the firm's first chief executive from outside the family. Pedder had spotted Parker in a magazine profile, a London Business School graduate, then in his 30s, who had turned around the Kenwood domestic appliance business with what one journalist described as a kind of brisk Englishness. The curly-headed fellow, Pedder called him. Parker accepted the offer. He moved to Somerset. He read the books. His first internal document, called Strategy, Structure and Management, set out the problem. Clark's was still manufacturing around 70% of its shoes in the United Kingdom, in a market where its competitors were manufacturing almost none of theirs in their home countries. The United States imported 95% of its shoes. Italian brands made shoes in Romania. German brands made shoes in Vietnam. Clark's was the last European footwear major still rooted in domestic manufacture, and the rooting was, in Parker's analysis, the thing that was killing it. The second document, The Road Ahead, set out the answer. The shoes would have to be made overseas. The retail side would have to grow. The structure would have to be flattened. A layer of middle management would have to go. The manufacturing workforce in Somerset and Cumbria and the rest of the UK estate would have to be progressively reduced. Parker had a way of describing what he was doing that has stayed in the record. The company, he said, had got confused between benevolence and inaction. Sometimes you used the notion that you were being benevolent to avoid taking hard decisions. That, he said, was destructive in the long term. Pedder, backing him, was sharper. Preserving that which has no future beyond its natural life, Pedder said, is not just dangerous, it's anti-social. These were the words that began the dismantling, the Quaker grammar of welfare, the houses, the pool, the theatre, the foot gauge, the multi-generational employment was reframed in the language of the financial spreadsheet as inaction dressed up as kindness. Some of the Clark's workforce understood the logic. Most felt it as a betrayal so deep they did not have language for it. Through the late 1990s, the Somerset factories closed one by one. Some were sold as going concerns to Doc Martens, the boot brand that had inherited the British leather-making tradition along a different line. Some were demolished. Some became warehouses. The street factory itself had already gone. K Shoes in Kendal was the next great fall. The Cumbrian sister company Clark's had bought in 1981 to save from a hostile takeover. The firm that had once employed 1 in 5 working people in the town. K Shoes manufacturing in Kendal ceased in 2003, with the loss of 167 jobs. The last K factory at Millom, on the Cumbrian coast, would close in 2006. Jonathan Somervell, a former recruitment manager at K Shoes and great-great-nephew of the founder, said what most people in Kendal felt. It was devastating for the town. 3 generations of many families had earned their livelihood with K. In Street itself, the loss of around 400 jobs in the first wave of Parker's restructuring meant the loss of nearly a quarter of the manufacturing workforce. Parker, to his credit, went to the parish council to account for himself. The councillors asked him to promise that there would be no further redundancies. It was an assurance he could not give. He remembered the meeting, years later, vividly. The room, the faces, the impossible request, the honesty of saying no. The professional managers had arrived. Parker had reduced the headcount, moved production overseas in stages, and begun the conversion of Clark's from a manufacturer into what the strategy documents called a brand. The family that had voted in 1993 not to sell to Beresford was watching the firm do, slowly and from within, exactly what Beresford would have done from without. The tragedy was not that the family had been wrong to vote against the sale. The tragedy was that the sale had only ever been one of 2 ways for the same thing to happen. The other way was slower and more painful and was being carried out, with patient professionalism, by managers the family itself had hired. Chapter 9. The Last Factory. In 2002, Tim Parker left Clark's to run Samsonite, the luggage firm, and later the National Trust. His successor was Peter Bolliger, Swiss-born, the former managing director of Harrods, the man who had been running Clark's UK operations under Parker. Bolliger inherited a company in mid-transition. Most of the manufacturing was already overseas. A small number of UK plants remained, mostly in Somerset, mostly making the more specialist lines. The retail business was growing. The Desert Boot was being made under license in India. The Wallaby was being made in Vietnam. The children's school shoes were being made in China. Bolliger's job was to finish what Parker had started. On the 13th of January 2005, Clark's announced the closure of its last United Kingdom shoe factory. The site was at Ilminster, a market town in South Somerset, 20 miles from Street. 90 jobs would go. Production would move to India, China, and Romania. The final UK plant would close in April 2005. The company's statement said the move was vital to ensure that the business remained financially viable as UK production costs continued to rise. After 175 years of manufacturing British shoes in Britain, the firm that had built Street out of the meadows would make no more shoes in the country of its founding. 90 jobs at Ilminster. It was a small number. By the standards of the great industrial closures, Longbridge, Ravenscraig, the South Wales pits, it was almost nothing, but it was the last number. The Footwear Union KFAT, the National Union of Knitwear, Footwear and Apparel Trades, had by that point merged with the ISTC to form the union now called Community. There were no famous union speeches at Ilminster. There were no occupations. The workers, 90 of them, knew their notice was coming and knew that resistance would change nothing. The decision had been made in Street. The factories were being closed in the order their managers chose to close them. Ilminster was simply the one that happened to be last. A staff member who had visited the new Vietnamese factory in the late 1990s left a single sentence that became, in the company's own oral history, the epitaph of the entire transition. There must have been 150 people, the staff member said, and they made 1,000 pairs a day, whereas with us, there were 12, and we used to make 1,000 pairs a day. 12 people in Somerset making 1,000 pairs. 150 in Vietnam making the same 1,000 pairs. The skill of the Somerset 12 was what made them expensive. The number of the Vietnamese 150 was what made them cheap. The shoe was the same shoe. The wage bill was not the same wage bill. Anyone who could read a balance sheet could see what was coming. In Ilminster, on a wet morning in April 2005, the last shifts ended. The machines were turned off. The lasts were boxed up. The leather scraps were swept into bins. The workers walked through the gates for the last time. The last K factory at Millom closed the following year. The Clark's factory in Bushmills, in Northern Ireland, where some of the women's lines had been made, had already gone. The factory at Padmore and Barnes in Kilkenny, which had made the Wallaby for 40 years, had gone into a management buyout in 1987 and would not survive much longer either. 180 years of Clark's making shoes in the British and Irish Isles ended in Ilminster in April 2005. There was no national news bulletin that gave the closure more than a paragraph. The Western Daily Press carried it. The local BBC carried it. The Draper's trade paper carried it. The shoes the country had grown up in were now being made on the other side of the world, and the country had decided, somewhere in the previous decade, that this did not constitute a story. Walking through the empty Ilminster site in the weeks afterwards, you would have seen the marks on the floor where the machines had stood, bolts in concrete, oil stains, the faint smell of leather that takes years to leave a building, the signs above the departmental doors, the lasting room, the closing room, the making room, the polishing room. Walter Bobbitt's litany, skive the stiffeners, take down the sole, hole 'em, tack 'em on the last, was now the description of a process that no longer happened in Britain. The clock tower in street still kept time, the pool still swam, the library still lent, the factory was gone. Chapter 10. The Hong Kong Ending. The years after 2005 were not kind to Clark's. The brand survived, the retail estate grew, the children's foot gauge still measured the feet of British 5-year-olds in shops on every high street. The Desert Boot still sold 10 million pairs each decade, but the company beneath the brand began to drift. Successive chief executives, Melissa Potter, Mike Sherwood, Giorgio Presca, Victor Herrero, came and went. The family's grip loosened. The institutional pressures the family had once held off began to close in. Online retail was eating the high street footprint. Other brands had reached scale in casual footwear and were taking the territory Clark's once owned. In 2017, in a moment that read at the time like an apology and now reads like a footnote, Clark's announced the opening of a robot-assisted factory in street itself. The plant was called Morelight. It was meant to make 300,000 desert boots a year. Up to 80 jobs would be created. The chief executive at the time, Mike Sherwood, said that Clark's had always led the way in shoe design and manufacture. The headline writers called it a reshoring. The factory opened. In January 2019, the factory's closure was announced. It had failed to meet its production and cost targets. 35 workers were made redundant. 10 were redeployed. The reshoring had lasted less than 2 years. The Clark's press release said the decision meant the firm would no longer manufacture any of its products in Britain. The note was small and quiet and final. The robots that were going to bring the work back home had failed to bring the work back home, and the work would not now be coming back. In 2020, the pandemic arrived. High streets closed. Retail collapsed. Clark's went into a company voluntary arrangement, a form of insolvency reorganisation under English law. The CVA was approved by 90% of the firm's creditors. 60 stores were moved to nil rent. Around 900 corporate jobs were cut, including 108 at the street headquarters itself. Gavin Maher, the Deloitte partner who handled the CVA, said the business had been faced with weaker consumer confidence and reduced footfall, placing acute liquidity pressure on the group. On the 4th of November 2020, Clark's announced a £100 million investment by a Hong Kong-based private equity firm called Lion Rock Capital. The deal ended the Clark family's effective control after 195 years. The family, which had still held something close to 80% of the equity in 2013, had gone. Daniel Tsung, Lion Rock's founder, gave a careful statement. He believed, he said, that Lion Rock's investment would create a stable platform for the company to manage through an unprecedented crisis and to expedite the brand's growth globally going forward. 2 months later, in January 2021, a Chinese company called Viva China Holdings, founded by the Olympic gymnast turned entrepreneur Li Ning, bought a controlling share of Lion Rock's stake in Clark's. By February 2023, Lion Rock had sold its remaining indirect interest to Viva China. The company that had made shoes for the British school child for 160 years was now controlled from Hong Kong by a Chinese sportswear group. The new chief executive was Victor Herrero, formerly of Guess. Herrero arrived with a brief to cut costs. He offered staff at the Westway Distribution Centre near street the choice of lower wages or redundancy. The Financial Times reported that the policy provoked resentment among many lifelong employees and fury from unions, with many staff with long service moved on to minimum wage contracts. In 2021, around 140 workers at the Westway Distribution Centre, the warehouse that holds, at any given moment, about 5 million pairs of Clark's shoes, went on strike. The community union led the action. The shop steward was a man called Trevor Stevens. The dispute centred on what the workers called fire and rehire. New contracts had been offered that cut the hourly rate from £11, £16 to £9.50. Paid breaks were removed. Sick pay was cut to the statutory minimum. Redundancy entitlements were cut to the statutory minimum. Dave Chappell, of the Mendip Trades Union Council, said he had met 4 Clark's workers who feared losing their homes. He called it the brave new world of Clark's new owners. Members of Parliament wrote to Herrero demanding an end to fire and rehire. The strike ran for weeks. Trevor Stevens was the great-grandson of nothing in particular. His own family had been Clark's people. He had grown up in street. He was standing in 2021 in a picket line outside the warehouse that stored the shoes he could not afford to buy, made in factories in countries he had never seen, distributed by workers paid less than the minimum his grandparents had earned, owned by a company in Hong Kong he had never visited. The Quaker town had reached the place all the loops had been bringing it to. Chapter 11. What remains? In street today, the clock tower still keeps time. It chimes the quarter hours over the high street the brothers built. Anthony, the compressed air engine, made in Bradford in 1910, still stands inside the old factory block, preserved by the firm with a kind of affection. He no longer pushes air to the making departments because there are no making departments. He no longer heats the pool because the pool has its own boiler now. The pool itself, Greenbank, still opens every summer. It is run as a charity. Children swim in the water Alice Clark left her money for. The building is listed. The water is warm. The Strode Theatre still puts on plays. The Crispin School still teaches the children of street. Crispin Hall reopened in 2024 after renovation and has craftspeople in residence and a cafe with good coffee. The Bear Inn serves alcohol. It has done since the 1970s. The Quaker temperance has lifted and the village drinks the way most English villages drink. The houses on Wilfrid Road still stand. The homework rooms, where outworkers once stitched in the evenings, are now back bedrooms and home offices. The grandchildren of the women who worked in the closing room live in some of those houses. The work that built them is gone. The Clark's Village Outlet Mall, opened in 1993 on the carcass of the manufacturing site, attracts something close to 4 million visitors a year now. There are more than 90 stores. It is one of the most successful outlet centres in Britain. The car parks are large. The signage is good. The cafes are full. On a Saturday afternoon, the visitors walk the same ground that the workers walked, in the same shape of buildings, doing different work entirely. The Alfred Gillett Trust holds the company archive. In September 2025, in its bicentenary year, Clark's opened a new shoemakers museum at a building called The Grange. 25,000 pairs of shoes in the collection. The history of the firm laid out for visitors. The exhibits include the brown Petersburg slipper that James Clark first cut from sheepskin offcuts, the desert boot Nathan Clark designed and the board nearly refused to make, the foot gauge that measured 95% of British children. The shoes in the museum are British. The shoes in the shops, almost all of them, are not. In 2025, Clark celebrated 200 years of trading. The bicentenary advertising spoke of heritage and craft and a Somerset village with a clock tower. None of the shoes in the bicentenary collection were made within 1,000 miles of street. The 40 High Street address remains the headquarters. The postcode, BA160EQ, has been turned into part of the brand language by the marketing department. C:J 1825, BA160EQ. The address of a factory that no longer exists, printed onto shoes made in countries the founders had never heard of, sold from a high street the family no longer owns, to children whose grandparents were once paid in brown envelopes through a window in the same village. The Quaker founders would have understood the village. They would have understood the museum. They would have understood the pool and the theatre and the library and the Bear Inn finally serving beer. They might have struggled, standing on the high street in 2025, to understand the silence where the factory used to be, not through one failure, through 40 years of decisions, each one defensible on its own day, each one rational on a balance sheet, each one moving the work a little further from the hands that knew how to do it. The village kept its pool. It lost its trade.